Hey everyone, welcome back to another detailed C4 Corvette video. Today we're going to be talking about suspension sets for C4s and their differences from the 1984 to 96 model years. Now in front of me I have two different sets of suspensions. I have an 87 set here and a 94 set. And with these two suspensions we can use those to go over a lot of the major differences from the 84 to 87 versions and the 88 to 96 versions. Now, a vast majority of the cars that we tear down will have their suspensions sold in this way, how they sit here from rotor to rotor complete. These are really common to use these suspensions in custom builds, very common in things like Tri-5 Chevys, older pickup trucks, even C1, C2 Corvettes. I mean, really, if you know how to use a welder, you can make it happen with one of these suspensions in your next build. If you pay attention to a lot of the televised auctions, you'll notice that a lot of the resto mods that roll across the block will be on C4 Corvette suspensions. So one of the big things that we will be going over in this is that these suspensions are different in length between the 84 to 87 and the 88 to 96 versions. Your early suspensions, 84 to 87, are going to have a dimension from rotor to rotor that's going to be 59.5 inches, whereas your later suspensions are going to be 61.5 inches overall width. Now this is important depending on what you're building. If you're building a Tri-5 Chevy, a lot of the guys with the wider body cars, they're going to want a wider suspension to start with. Some of you C1, C2 builders, you may like to go with the early suspensions, so you're a little bit narrower, works out a little bit better with your wheel offset choices that you may want to use. All really depends on what your build is going to be in the end. This video, while it's going to help out the custom car builders, it's also going to be for you Corvette owners out there too. So we'll go through some of the component differences between these and see what changed over the years, what's different on one setup versus another setup. There's going to be a lot of little details and things that we get through there, and if my head isn't spinning by the end of it, trying to keep all of it straight in my head, I mean, it'll be a good day, but it may take a number of takes to get through this one. Going back over to the 84 to 87 suspensions, you know, for you Corvette owners out there, that is the reason those suspensions being shorter overall is the reason that you have to use wheel spacers a lot of times when you put the later Corvette wheels or a lot of the aftermarket wheels onto the 84 to 87 cars because they are shorter overall. 88 to 96s, you won't have that same problem there. But this video is for both you custom builders and you existing Corvette owners. We're going to take these suspensions, we're going to get them set up on a table so that we can take a better look at them, and we'll start from there. So we're going to start with taking a look at the front suspensions. I have two suspensions here on the table. I have a 1987, which will give us a good representation of 84 to 87 suspension components, and I have a 94 front suspension, which will give us an idea of the later 88 to 96 styles. Now we're going to take a look at just one side because basically, you know, one side's going to be the same as the other. But we're going to take a look, start at the control arms first. So with your upper and lower control arms, they are both going to be 84 to 87 and then 88 to 96. This is an 84 to 87 style control arm here. And over here we have the 88 to 96 style control arm. Now the visual difference that you'll find between these two is that your 88 to 96, there's going to be a flat spot on the top center bar that is faced directly out to the side. Whereas we come over to the 84 to 87 control arms, it has that flat spot straight up. There's also a difference within the bolts on top. So the bolt spacing from where the control arm goes to the K member, 6.5 inches on the early control arms, and your later 88 to 96s will be spaced at 5.5 inches. So moving from there to our lower control arms, again, lower control arms 84 to 87. The 84 to 87 versions will have a plate mounted on top of the control arm where the shock and sway bar link mount directly to that plate. We come over to the 88 to 96 lower control arms. You'll see we do not have that plate, and our sway bar link and our shock mount directly to the control arm itself. Now dimensionally, those control arms, the 88 to 96 is going to be a little bit longer than the 84 to 87. And you'll find that throughout the upper and lower control arms as well. The other piece that we have in the side here, major piece, is going to be the knuckles. Now, knuckles, dimensionally, they're going to be 84 to 87 and 88 to 96, but there are a number of changes in those. So first, on your early ones, you're going to have an 84 specific knuckle, an 85 specific, and then 86 and 87s will be the same. So the differences in those is on your 84s, you're going to have a little bit difference in the caliper bolting to the bracket than what you have on the 85, 6, and 7 version. Then 85, updated caliper bracket bolting. Moved to 86, that was the first year for ABS in the Corvettes. So in the front of the knuckle, there is a bore, and that is where your wheel speed sensor would go for your 86 and 87 cars. Now moving over to the 88 to 96 knuckles, again, they're dimensionally then going to be different. This one here is from a 94, but if you had an 88 to 90, they will have in this section here, it'll have a bore just like the earlier ones for a wheel speed sensor. Starting in 91, the ABS sensor went to be part of the wheel bearing and hub assembly. There's actually a bore in the back of the knuckle for that ABS sensor to protrude through once ever it's installed. There's another minor difference with these, and that is your 94, 5, 6. Again, this is from a 94. They will have a small casting change in this little ridge that's present. Your 91 through 93s, they will not have that ridge in that area, but dimensionally, a 91 to 96 knuckles, they're all the same. So now we'll move on to talk about the brake caliper setups for these two different versions. So starting over here, we have our 84 to 87 calipers and rotors. These were all an 11-inch rotor with a single piston caliper. I'd already mentioned before about the difference with the brake caliper bracket bolting in 84, but 85, 6, 7s would all be the same. There wasn't any options in the earlier cars, you just got the 11-inch brake rotors here. Moving over to the 88 to 96 versions here, this is the 12-inch RPO code JL9. These are a dual piston caliper. These were used on all cars from 88 until 94. Now there was an additional brake option that was the J55 13-inch rotors and upgraded calipers. You found those on 88 to 94 Z51, Z07, ZR1 cars would have those. And then starting in 95, all 95 and 96 cars came with the 13-inch J55 brakes. There was one other additional brake package. It was still a J55, but that was on your 96 Grand Sports and Collector's editions. And that, we have one over here. This is the Grand Sport Collector Edition J55 13-inch rotor and caliper. For the Collector's Editions, they are powder-coated black with a Corvette script on the outside of the caliper. You can take any J55 brake setup and apply it to an 88 to 94, just as long as you change that bracket to go with it and change your rotor there, and you can make that work for yourself. Now, for you guys out there using these suspensions for your custom builds, the price is going to vary a lot of times on your suspension setups depending on what brake package that they do have. But don't let that concern you too much. There are different bracket kits and things like that available out there for those that want to run bigger brakes. You can easily adapt these to run later Corvette C5, 6, even C7 stuff out there. Or any of your Willwood packages or things like that, all depending on what you want for the build of your car in the end. Now we'll go up to the sway bars and sway bar links. With these you have an 84 to 87 and an 88 to 96 dimensionally. This one here is an 87 again. There is a minor difference on your 84s within the center section. On 84s, you'll have a couple funky bends in them that you won't see in other years. But then your 85, 6, 7s are all straight across design. Now with the sway bars, you will have different various size options depending on the codes, the RPO codes of what suspensions you had, different diameters of them. But again, dimensionally 84 to 87, you have a sway bar link bracket here. These are going to be specific 84 to 87 with how they mount down onto the plate. Moving up to the 88 to 96 ones, again, these are going to be dimensionally for 88 to 96. You're going to have different diameters of these depending on different options that the cars had. And also your sway bar links, again, are going to be 88 to 96 since they bolt directly to the control arm. Now also within there, we have the front monoleaf spring. On those, you're going to have two basic styles, an 88 to 96 and also an 84 to 87, dimensionally as far as interchangeability. But within the springs, there are different spring rates that again came with different options the car had, whether it was Z51 or ZR1 or whichever have you there. And there is codes that are on the bottom of the springs that you can actually visually see from under the car, and you can look those codes up to see what spring rate that you do have in the car. Now for a lot of you custom builders out there, those springs, they're probably going to be one of the first things to go. You'll get them out of there and then you'll go over to a coilover setup, changing out the shock there and completely do away with that front spring. There is one other part within here. There is it's called a spring retainer bracket. We have it here on this early one, and they are also the same of what we have on the later ones, this little metal bracket that's down in there. You will find those on the same for 84 to 94 cars. Once you got to 95 and 96, they don't really do much, and they actually got rid of them in the 95 to 6 cars. So moving on to the steering racks now, I'll just briefly touch on this because steering racks really could be a video all in themselves of their differences. Basically what it comes down to, you have your steering rack mounted in here, and we have a early style 84 to 87 racks back here dimensionally wise. There are some differences on the 84, 85 steering racks. We move up here, we have our later style, dimensionally the same 88 to 96. You will see a lot of differences as the year ranges for these steering racks and different sources out there. A lot of that comes down to the different steering ratios, lock to lock turns that the steering racks had depending on the options of the cars. You'll also see a difference on ones noted 88 to 92, and that difference comes down to the inner tie rod and the connection within there. But if you're not pulling a steering rack apart, that difference really is not going to affect you. But just the big takeaway is dimensionally 88 to 96 on those steering racks. Now you also notice, on the front of this, we have a power steering cooler, being this is from a 94. On your LT1 cars, you're commonly going to see the steering cooler up there. On your early cars, the steering cooler was an option. Started in 87 on your Z51 cars, then was an option up until 91. You'd have them on the Z51s. You'd also have them on ZR1s. They would be a little bit different on the ZR1s versus the ones for the L98 cars. The earlier steering coolers, you don't commonly see those as much. Moving on next here, we have our steering shafts. So starting up with the early one, this shaft here is a 92 to 96 style of intermediate steering shaft. And back here, with a rag joint more in the center of it, this is an 86 to 91 style steering shaft. And there also was an 84 to 85 steering shaft, and you should have a picture of that to be able to cut in for you here. All right, so moving on to the shocks. Shocks are going to be a little bit more involved here. You do have differences in the original manufacture of the shocks over years, but dimensionally wise, we have an 84 to 87, and then we have our later shocks. Well, kind of. So starting with here on the first one, on our 84 to 87 shock, they're all going to be dimensionally the same. And as I had mentioned before, with that shock mounting to the lower bracket down below there. But the big thing that we need to point out here is notice the height of this upper shock tower on this 84 to 87 style front end. When we come over to the later style front ends, notice that that shock tower is now much shorter. Now that shorter shock tower, you will find that on 89 and later cars. Any of you 88 owners out there, you've probably came about and noticed that 88s has some funky stuff going on with the shocks on those. And that is because an 88 will still use a tall shock tower like an 84 to 87, but the bottom of the shock is meant to mount directly on the control arm, like how it does on the later ones. Now moving past the 88s, for 89 and later, you had the option for adjustable suspension. So 89 to 95, it was the FX3 shocks, and they would have a small actuator that went on top of the shock that could turn to various positions and control the damping rate. There was two different versions of the FX3. There was an 89 to 91 version and then a 92 to 95 version. That difference comes down into the amount of rotation that it takes for the shock adjustment nut to turn between your different settings. After that, you had 96, the F45 shocks. Those shocks would be all black, and then they had a linkage that came off the side that connected onto the control arm that gave feedback back to the computer so the computer could keep track of the position and damping rates of the shock. All right, for the last section we'll cover on the front suspensions here, we're going to talk about the K-members or the engine cradles, all within the center of the frame rails here. So with these, we have a couple different variations. First off, back here we have the 84 to 87 style K-member. And the one thing that we are going to notice within here that's going to make it specific 84 to 87 is, first off, we have these protrusions that come up for capturing the engine motor mount brackets with a horizontal bolt in through this location here. The second thing that we'll have is, as I mentioned before, the spacing on the bolts for the upper control arms. Now once we got to the 88 to 91, again, this bolting here is going to change and it's going to get narrower, but we're still, with the L98 engines, going to have the protrusions in the K-member that come up to capture the standard style small block Chevy motor mount bolts. When we come up to this one here, for your 92 to 96 LT motors, you'll notice we no longer have those protrusions, but we have this flat plate here where the engine mount was then secured down by a single bolt. Now this style of K-member, you're also going to find that on the 90 to 91 ZR1 as well. So 90, 91 ZR1s had these, and 92 and later they all use this style of K-member. So we have one other thing, and that's going to be these frame stiffener brackets in here. And for this one, I have a cheat sheet on this one because you'll see why in a moment. This gets a little bit complicated to understand. So first off, these stiffener brackets that we have back here, this is the second version of those. Now, I do have a picture, I think, of the first version that we'll try to splice in here. So the first version was smaller and skinnier, what we have there, and it would have been on 84 to 88 non-Z51 or non-Z52 cars, and also not on convertibles. Now this setup here is from an 87 convertible, so a 86 or 87 convertible, and then also your Z51, Z52 cars up until 88 would have this wider style of frame stiffeners back there. Then 89 to 91, these stiffener brackets became the standard. Moving up then to 92, you have a different style of stiffener brackets on the rear that are made to mount underneath the flat perches for the LT motors. And likewise for the ZR1s, since the 9091 ZR1s use this later style of K-member, they will also use that style of frame stiffener brackets. So I think I got through that there without making any mistakes, but that covers it on the front suspensions. We're going to move over to the rears now. All right, so we have our rear suspensions up on the table here now to go through. Now these rears are also from the same cars as what we had for our fronts that were up here earlier. So in back here, we have a Dana 36 rear end from a 1987, and the one in the front here is a Dana 44 from a 1994. Now, many of you know already, but we'll go through it. The Dana 36 came with all automatic transmission Corvettes, 84 through 96. The Dana 44s is what you got with your manual transmission cars starting in 85 through 96. With these two rear end housings here, the one way that you can look at a Dana 36 and a Dana 44 to tell the difference is, first off, on this Dana 36, you'll notice we have a center ridge running down the top of the casing. On the Dana 44 in front here, we'll have 3 ribs that are going along the front of that casing. Now the 3-rib design for the Dana 44s is true for 1988 through 96 Corvettes. The 85 to 87 Dana 44s, the housing was a little bit different and has a design that more resembles a Dana 36 in its visual appearance looking at the top of the case. But the real way to go and know the difference between a 36 and a 44 is to look at the bolts on top of the batwing going into the case. So on a Dana 44, you'll have 2 bolts on the top of the case on the outside ends, whereas on the Dana 36, you'll have a single center bolt in the top of that case. Now the Dana 36, it had some various gear ratio options over the years. They were 259, 273, 308 was really the best that you got with the Dana 36s. In the Dana 44s, you had a 308, which was in your earlier year Dana 44s, and then later you had a 333, 345 by most of your later 91s. There was also a 354, which they're a bit more rare, and they were in some of the 89, 90 Corvettes. So moving forward then with these, we'll talk about the bat wings that are bolted to the rear housing. So dimensionally, outside to outside, the bat wings are all the same, whether it's an early or a late suspension. You obviously will have the difference in the bat wings for the bolts that go to the rear housing there between a 36 or a 44. If you are getting into a situation where, say, you're doing a Dana 44 swap into a car that was a Dana 36, the one thing that you will need to note is that a Dana 44 housing is longer in the front here from out to the snout and the yoke. When you put a Dana 44 into a car that didn't have it, it was a Dana 36 car, you will need to change the C-beam up to the transmission and the drive shaft, as the length of those varies slightly depending on the length of the rear end, whether it was a 44 or a 36. Now another thing that you do have to watch out for, and it's just a minor difference, but on your Dana 36 and the 44s, on your 84 to 87 versions, in the back on the strut rod bracket, there's 2 bolts, lower bolts, that the strut rod bracket shares. 84 to 87, those bolts are going to be a smaller size than what you would find in 88 to 96 style rear ends. So anytime if you make that swap between say a late Dana 44 and you have an early bat wing or something like that, you may run into a situation where you have to enlarge those holes in either the case or the bat wing to make sure that everything lines up and works the way it should. So regarding the half shafts that we have on these suspensions here, half shafts are dimensionally the same from 84 to 96. Doesn't matter if it's a Dana 44 or a Dana 36, they're all going to be the same dimension. There is a difference within the construction of these over the years, where some of the earlier ones will be a thinner material than what the later ones were, but otherwise, if you need to swap one out, 84 to 96 half shafts are all the same there again. All right, so we have our suspensions here flipped around so we can take a look at the backs of them. And just so you're not confused, we have, this is the 87 early and this is the late 94 suspension. So first thing that we're gonna go look at on the back of here is we have the lower strut arms. Now the lower strut arms are gonna be 84 to 87. And then you have the 88 to 96 versions. The strut arms are very similar in dimensions between them. If anything, the 88 to 96 one is a little bit thicker design than what the earlier ones were. Moving back to the upper part of the strut arm, we have the strut arm bracket to the rear end. Notice that the 84 to 87 version is flat on the bottom. When we come up to the later style, the 88 to 96 brackets, it sits at an angle. And then on the front of these, down here at the bottom, there are 2 springs. There's an additional bracket on those. You'll find that on the 92 and later cars, also 90 ZR1s. That's for your exhaust hangers. An early car would have a exhaust hanger like this, just a black rubber strap, bolts onto the C-beam to hold the exhaust up at the rear, versus those 2 springs on the bottom of the strut arm brackets. So. Next thing we got in the back here, we have our rear springs. These springs for the rears, they are actually physically interchangeable from 84 all the way up to 96. They're dimensionally the same. between those years. Like the fronts though, you do have different spring rates of those, whether it's stiffer or softer depending on the options that the car originally had. There's codes on the suspension or on those springs that you can use to match them up for what you need, but if you find yourself in a pickle, you can just use them for many years there. Next thing we got on the back here is we have our rear toe link assemblies. Now again, these will interchange from 84 to 96, dimensionally the same. However, there is a difference. On your 84 to 91, you'll have a male portion coming off the tie rod end, and then your 92 to 96, the tie rod end is a female design, the male portion coming out of the rod of the toe link. So that's an important thing to keep note of if you're using one of these in a custom build. Keep track of what year they came out of in case you ever need to order new tie rod ends for that rear. The last thing we got on the rear here is the sway bars. Like most of the other things on the back here, physically they can be swapped between 84 to 96. You do have different thicknesses of the sway bars, again with the different options and suspension packages of the car. For example, this 87 version here and this later version, you can see the difference in thicknesses between those two, but from side to side they're physically the same. They bolt on to either suspension. So that wraps up everything on the rear here, and we'll move around and we'll take a look at the sides and the knuckles and the end assemblies. First off, to recap what we said earlier, the 84 to 87s are narrower than what the 88 to 96 versions are. And all of that width difference in the rear ends is going to be made up within the knuckle and brake components within the end of the suspension. So here we have the 84 to 87 style rear knuckle. They're going to be dimensionally the same for those years, but actually 84 and 85 will not have a wheel speed sensor. 86 and 87 do have the wheel speed sensor, as 86 was first year for ABS. We move over to the 88 to 96 style rear knuckle. Those are going to be the same for all years, and the hole for the wheel speed sensor is on the back of the 88 to 96 rear knuckle setups that we have there. Your wheel speed sensors are going to be the same for 88 through 94. 95 and 96 are each different. So moving on from that, we go talk about the brakes here. So on the early suspensions, and this is probably one of the easiest ways to identify an early suspension, is it's going to have a dust shield on the back of behind the rotor, and on the front of the rotor we have a top hat. We have a top hat in there because the 84 to 87 uses a drum style parking brake. On the 88 to 96, again, our rotor size is going to be the same, 11-inch with a single piston rear caliper, but on the 88 to 96, the parking brake mechanism is built within the caliper itself. So we have a mechanism in here with the cable attached to it to lock on the parking brake within that manner there. You also notice that we have an additional bracket, spacer bracket within here, which our caliper is mounted on. There is a bracket in the assembly back for the 84 to 87 versions, but you can't see it underneath the dust shield in there. Now, that makes your parking brakes are going to be different between 84 to 87 and 88 to 96. Our front setup still has the parking brakes all on it. The 84 to 87s has been cut off as it was damaged, and if you ever removed an 84 to 87 parking brake, they're a lot of fun to get off. So moving on from those items, we can go and we can talk about the shocks. And on our shocks, we have the 84 to 87 style shocks. And on the top of those, we are going to have this barrel. And within the frame of the 84 to 87, we would have a bracket that would come and accept a horizontal bolt to mount the top of that shock in. When we go up to the 88 to 96, that is instead replaced with a flat plate here, and the frame would have a hole to allow the top of this section to extend upward into the frame, and you would have two bolts that go up in through here to bolt the top of the shock into the frame there. Now this top section here, that also allows for space for the FX3 suspension with the actuator that needs to be mounted on top so that it would be recessed up into the frame on your 89 and 90 to 95 style of shocks. Now, one thing I did forget to mention here, we have our spindle assembly that's inside these rear suspensions in the knuckles here. Spindles are going to run 84 to 85 because they will not have the pickup teeth on them for the wheel speed sensor, then 86, 87s, and then we would have our 88 to 96 spindles. They would all be of the same design. So the last component here that we have to talk about is the rear control arms, commonly called the rear dog bone control arms. They kind of look like dog bones there. These are going to be the same dimensionally for 84 to 96, and actually 84 all the way up to 95 are going to be an aluminum design just like we have here. When we get to the 96s, they are going to be a composite material, and that composite material also has a sleeve along the shaft, and there would be a rod for your cars with the adjustable F45 suspension for that rod to connect into the shock and send signals back to the computer, letting it know its position. So that is about everything that we have here for the rear suspensions. Again, like we said, 84 to 87, they're going to be narrower, but everything, bat wings, half shafts, springs, toe links, all of that, 84 to 96, basically the same applicable. And then your 88 to 96 versions, all the width difference is made up in the rear end. Well, there you have it. That's the differences between the front and rear suspensions for the 84 to 96 Corvettes. I know I threw a lot of different year ranges and things out there, and it can be a lot to take in. Hopefully we got everything right. Like with anything, I know that we missed something, but it does take a long time to go through, make sure that I get all my notes straight and get that information out there as accurately as I can to you guys. Now, if you have any questions additional on this, feel free to send us a message, mirrockcorvette.com. If you're a custom builder, I hope that we at least helped educate you on some of the differences that you can see in these suspensions so that you can pick one out for your next build, whatever that may be. We usually have these suspensions available. It's going to vary based on timing, you know, Dana 44s versus 36s. Obviously a lot more Dana 36s than there are 44s. And the year range is going to be available, but if you have any questions, get in touch with us through our website. We'd be glad to help you out. So thank you everybody for watching. We really appreciate it, and subscribe, and we'll see you again next time.